Welcome to UO Today. I'm Paul Pepis, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. My guest today is Vera Keller, Assistant Professor of History at the University of Oregon Robert D. Clark Honors College. Keller is a historian of science and an early modern Europeanist. She's interested in the co-production of science and politics. Keller is the author of articles and book chapters on the history of friendship, constitutions, wish lists, celebrity, secrets, invention, alchemy, and magic. Keller, along with fellow UO faculty member Marc Schachter, organized the Oregon Rare Books Initiative, a research interest group supported by the Oregon Humanities Center. Thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you.
First of all, congratulations on being awarded a Mellon Fellowship at the Rare Books School at the University of Virginia.
Thank you.
How will the fellowship help you advance your scholarship?
It's a pretty interesting initiative. I'm kind of excited about it, not just for me, but for the humanities in general, because it's sort of a unique idea. Michael Suarez, who's the director of the Rare Book School at UVA, came up with this new concept he calls critical bibliography. A lot of people wonder what that means. You know, they look at the title of this fellowship, the Mellon Fellowship in Critical Bibliography, and they've never heard the term critical bibliography before. That's because Michael just invented it. And what he's trying to do is bring together two areas of expertise which have really grown asunder in the past couple of decades in the humanities, and that is kind of technical experts in bibliography and humanities scholars who ask kind of larger questions. And it used to be, as he often laments, the case that the kind of technical study of manuscripts and books was a part and parcel of, say, an English literature PhD. That has long not been the case. And so these two communities have grown more and more separate, even though there's so much that they can do to mutually inform and strengthen each other. So this fellowship was created in order to bring humanities scholars like myself, who like to look at big picture questions but have had an enduring interest in the history of the book, in conversation with kind of technical experts like curators and librarians and bookmakers and booksellers, so that we can learn a lot more about the process and the technique of historical book production and use that to inform in a really rigorous way our scholarship. So I'm excited about that. It's a 3-year fellowship. And every year we take classes at the Rare Book School.
Is this during the summer?
Yeah, over the summer. And we also have funds to have events at our home campus, which I hope will bring more support and events to Oregon Rare Books Initiative in the future. We have field trips around the country and abroad in order to meet curators and librarians and experts that they can introduce us to help create a real community to advance this new idea of critical bibliography. So this is the second year of the fellowship. There's going to be a total of 3. So it was a kind of a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to jump on board and join this new initiative, and I'm pretty excited about it.
Is there a particular project that you're working on that this will advance, or is it just sort of general education that you're getting?
Well, it's actually my fantasy 3rd book project that I'm planning to use this mostly for. I'm currently working on my 2nd book, and my 3rd book is something I've been really interested in a long time. It's the history of social media. I'm fascinated by the books of friends that people started keeping in Europe in the 1540s, and I had one growing up as a child. And it's just the right moment to study the medieval and Renaissance origins of Facebook. So I really do want to write a history of friendship and social media, and I really think that this fellowship could help me with that, because as objects, they're quite complicated. They often are very interactive. They have many different types of media involved in them. So I think that being more rigorously trained in how to deal with those objects will really help me with that project.
So what led to your interest in rare books?
It might have been fate. I recently discovered that my grandmother, who, due to a long family saga, which we don't have to repeat here, I had never really met. Turns out she was crazy about rare books, and it turns out that she wrote a master's thesis in French in Hunter College in New York in the 60s on almost the same topic I wrote my first essay in college about. So for all I know, it's in my DNA. But I've been fascinated with rare books since I was an undergrad. I spent so much time in the rare books library, people thought I worked there. How often do you get to pick up an object that's 600 years old and just rifle through it? They don't let you do that with objects in museums. With books, you can. So if you really want to get a grip on the past through a material object, this is the way. So I've had a long-standing interest with it, and both my undergraduate faculty and my graduate faculty, I always veered towards the book historians, and I had a great intellectual, cultural, and historian of the book as my PhD advisor. So it's been long in the making.
So what was it like when you arrived and got to look at what we've got here in our rare books collection?
To tell you the truth, it took me a couple of years to realize how great the collection was here. In fact, I thought it wouldn't be, to the extent that when I first got my job offer, which I was totally thrilled about, one of the only things I asked for was some funds to buy rare books, because I didn't think we'd have the rare books that I wanted and needed to work with and teach with, because I had always taught with rare books materials as well in the past. So I didn't expect to find this collection. And then I was thinking about organizing an exhibit with my students, because I always like to do this kind of experiential learning with them, especially in the history of science, which is what I teach. And I wrote to James Fox, head of special collections, and I said, here's a list of about 70 books I found in the online catalog that I think could work for a history of science, primarily 17th, 18th century show. And he said, well, you know, most of our books aren't in the catalog. And I said, I did not know that. So they took me back there in the stacks. Bruce Tabb, who works in special collections, has been really helpful, taking me back many times now. And I was flabbergasted by what I saw there. Poor Bruce. He has heard my ear-piercing screams of delight many times now, because every time I turn the corner, there's just some other wonderful find. And every time I go back there, it's something new. And I was blown away. And I've worked in really fabulous libraries. I'm very archivally based. British Library, Royal Library in The Hague, lots of really great libraries. And I never expected to find something like that here.
It is one of the many amazing secrets about the University of Oregon. So tell us about the Oregon Rare Books Initiative.
So Marc Schachter in Romance Languages independently at the same time also found out about the great hidden riches of special collections. He also organized an exhibit for when they had the Italian Studies Association of America meeting here. So we got in conversation about that and decided that we really wanted to start a research interest group just to raise awareness about what's here, because a lot of people just have no idea the riches. And with generous funding from the Humanities Center and the Honors College, we started this research interest group, and it's been a really great year this past year, and we're looking forward to another great year in this coming year, hopefully. We've had a lot of events, great turnout, great participation.
So tell us about some of the events this past year.
We want to do a mix of speakers, local talent, and also speakers from off campus, because there is so much incredible talent on campus, and so many people who are already engaged with special collections or whose research could speak to it and they maybe don't even realize themselves. So we bring them to talk about their areas. We started off with Barbara Altman talking about Burgess MS1, or Oregon MS1, sorry, an incredible, very important medieval manuscript. It was fabulous. And we've also had Marc Schachter, my co-founder, Natalie Hester from on campus, and Gordon Sayre from on campus. And then from off campus, we had Anita Guarini from Oregon State and Ann Blair from Harvard. And every time they come to talk, we bring out books from the collection to show to the public along with their talk. We have some time to gather around the books and look at it with the speakers. And so that's really nice to have this kind of moment of community around these objects. I think the objects are a great way to bring people together, get them to prompt questions.
You recently co-curated with Jennifer Burns-Bright in English and Comparative Lit and students of the Honors College history class, History of Experiment, an exhibit of materials from special collections entitled Recipe, the Kitchen and Laboratory in the West from 1400 to 2000. You've brought along an art book made by students who participated. Tell us about that exhibit.
Well, so it's the second one I've done special collections material. The first one was called Printing Science, and that was showing some of the great strengths of history of science, because we have a very strong collection, history of science. And I was, as usual, back there getting very excited in the vault when I happened to see this row of pretty amazing 18th century cookbooks on the shelf. and kind of realized that this would be a great way to unite a couple of different communities, because, as I said, books are a great way to bring communities together, and to show what the cross conversations we could be having could be. And the history of recipes for my field, history of science, is very, very important. We think today of recipes as being primarily about food production. But before modern experimental science, recipes were just instructions for making anything. It comes from the Latin recipe, to take this ingredient and make something. So recipes date to a period when people produce things in the home. And with the emergence of laboratory-based experimental science, those kinds of productions of natural knowledge and kind of domestic knowledge separated. And along with that also came a gender split with the new kind of male-oriented scientific production and the increasingly homogeneously female-oriented domestic recipe culture. Those two kind of realms of knowledge production came back together again with phenomena like home economics, which is trying to bring kind of scientific learning back into the kitchen. So we wanted to do this longue durée exhibit showing how these phenomena, which you think of as being completely separate, how to make bread and how to discover Boyle's law, actually have this long and intertwined relationship. So that's why we planned this incredibly ambitious, large-scale exhibit, 1,400 to 2,000, but it was great. Many of the people in the show were themselves both experimental scientists and printers. For example, Benjamin Franklin, Joseph Moxon, Thomas Nuttall, they were themselves printers. And so the kind of knowledge about printing and how you figure out that technique relates kind of integrally to some of the kind of ingenious skills that you also need for experimentation. So that's the kind of third leg of this tripod: domestic recipe culture, experimental science, and rare books. Why should we have a show and special collections about recipes? Well, here's why. Printing is central to it. Printing is what creates that bridge between what I do in the home and what's going on in these other zones of expertise out there. And printing, again, gives us these objects which are the fruit of all of these experimentations and recipes. Maybe I'll just open it up so they can see. So the students in Rebecca Childers' letterpress printing class, I'm so impressed with them. They made this. They made the paper themselves out of bed linens, and they made the ink themselves out of botanical pigments that they experimented with. And here are some of their trial sheets. And these are, you can see many more of them in the exhibit. So for example, they say things like, yellow with blueberries, yellow with more blueberries. And so you can see them working through this trial and error method, which really warmed my heart as a historian of science, because this is the real life and blood of the way experimental science was being done, through this kind of experimentation, trying to get the recipe right. Inspired by works in the collection, they made these incredible images, a lot of pop-outs, which is a huge amount of work. Good recipe, and you can have a fist bump there. And I particularly actually like the text here because it shows that they really got the message of the exhibit. Here they talk about a book that I showed them and which is in the collection and in the show, American Medical Botany, the first color printed book in America by Jacob Bigelow. Bigelow was a professor of botany, really interested in technology. He's actually one of the first people to use that word in its modern sense. And while publishing this book about American botany, he invented this new technique for printing. And he did so experimenting with the very plants he was talking about. So as he talks about each plant, he also talks about his experiments trying to get his recipes for green to print correctly, for example. And what's especially cool about our edition of American Medical Botany is that he started off the old-fashioned way, having white and black engravings that he hired 22 young ladies to color in by hand, and found out his technique halfway through the printing. So in some runs, you can see it switching the middle, as in ours. So if you come to the show, you can compare the old technique and his new color printing. So here they are talking about Bigelow's technique and how that inspired them. And here's some images taken from, I believe this pop-up is in fact from Bigelow's American Medical Botany. And as they point out, through recipes, you can make anything: cosmetics, inks, weapons, glue, glass, and yes, food. It's not just about food production, it's for everything.
Fantastic. And you said that This brought together, there's some disparate communities of scholars and students on this campus that this exhibit aimed to bring together. Say a little bit about that.
Well, I wanted to bring together my own students in a colloquium in the Honors College on the history of experiment. I wanted to bring them together in conversation with actual objects, such as in the Rare Books room with the culture of recipe that they could learn from the AAA students, and with the literature students who have a whole other take on food studies than my students do. I really think that there's a bunch of different communities that special collections could really inspire, and I'm hoping that the artists in AAA in particular can use this artist book as an example of how creativity can come from 500-year-old books.
So you describe yourself as a scholar interested in the co-production of science and politics. What's that?
Well, here's where I make some scientists angry. So there is a very lively debate. Actually, it's simmered down within the history of science for a while now, but we have a problem in the history of science. We're historians, which means that we're interested in change over time, and there are a few things that we think did not change over time. And yet, we're not just historians, we're historians of science. So at the same time that we are emphasizing change over time, we also have something in our very title which suggests it has an essence. Science, it is, it was, it shall be. So we're always questioning that at the same time that we're studying it. Puts us in a difficult position. One of the questions that gets raised is what is science essentially? Is science essentially disinterested or not? And those kind of philosophers of science who want to see science as something kind of eternal and immutable would argue that it's disinterested. And sociologists of science who want to show the way that society produced science and it's intertwined with society's interest will say that it's interested. Where I saw someplace that I could make a contribution was the historical study of interest, because while sociologists of science often talk about the interests at play in the making of science, they don't actually historicize the concept of interest itself. They historicize science through interest without historicizing interest. So what I've been trying to do is look at the history of the idea of interest, and it has shaped so many things in Western society, including modern science, so in particular how those two have worked together. And I'd argue that the concept of disinterestedness, which has a long history I won't go into here, was partially an accident of political circumstance. But you could read my first book for that.
Your lists of interests is eclectic. History of friendship, constitutions, wish lists, celebrity, secrets, inventions, alchemy, and magic. I warned you I'm going to ask you this question. Is there anything that we could talk about that holds these disparate interests together?
There's a long and there's a short answer to that question. Maybe I'll give you the long.
You have like 8 minutes.
I have 8 minutes? Okay, I'll give you the long answer. So I have a very interesting background. I grew up in a ultra-Orthodox Jewish community outside of New York City, completely cut off from the modern world. So when I exited that community, what I really wanted to understand was modernity. And so I set out kind of voraciously hungry to understand this strange thing that I did not experience growing up and that I exited into. And that's why I became a historian of early modernity, because it seemed like many of the roots of modernity were to be found there, and in particular of the origins of science. So I've just been trying to, for myself somewhat narcissistically, answer this burning question of where did this come from? And what makes it so different from what I grew up experiencing. And one of the phenomena that I find very different is this idea of interest. The community I grew up in was not one that revolved around this concept of interest or self-interest. It was a very, very, very strong kind of hermetic community. So I really wanted to understand some of those deep structures of modernity, such as the public sphere, celebrity, self-interest, individualism, that differed from what I was used to. So at the root of all those seemingly eclectic interests are those burning questions to understand modernity.
No, that wasn't difficult at all. Did a wonderful job. Tell us about your book project, The Wish List, Knowledge and Interest, 1575 to 1725?
I discovered this topic while doing my dissertation research, which was on a different topic. Now I'm working on that topic again. That was about an alchemist and artist, an inventor named Cornelis Drebbel. He was a Dutch man who worked in London and Prague and built the first working submarine and feedback control mechanism and all sorts of wonderful things, and was very famous in his period, and then was completely forgotten for about 200 years. So I thought he would be a good window for me to analyze what was it about the history of science that we had forgotten about. You know, if this person was so influential and he's missing now, that means he can tell me something about the narrative that we've overlooked. Why was it that he was so famous? So I started exploring the different media in which he appeared in the period. How did he become famous? What was he being used for? Drama and engravings and natural philosophy and paintings and all sorts of different media. And I stumbled upon this weird phenomenon that people would keep lists of questions and things that they just wanted there to be answered or known or exist in the future. And he often appeared on this list. His objects often appeared on this list. And that was very curious because on the one hand, it was a way to make him famous, spread his name, but to doubt that he was actually credible because he's claiming these things, for example, perpetual motion machines. He made a very famous one for King James I. It was installed Eltham Palace outside London. Many tourists came to see it. Rubens actually made a copy of it. It was painted over 20 times. It was a major phenomenon in the early 20th century. Early 17th century. Can tell what century I live in. So if you have a wish list in the 17th century and this perpetual motion machine is on it, it's a really interesting artifact for a historian of science. On the one hand, it's saying, I really want that. I really want that to exist. At the same time, it's saying, I kind of doubt that it does. And for me, this was a totally fascinating genre, and I couldn't believe it had never been studied before, especially since, as I researched further, it turned out that the person who kind of invented this genre is Francis Bacon, who has been studied up the wazoo, and to find something so important that he had done that had never been studied before, I knew I had to work on this. So it was really interesting because the genre is fascinating, the intellectual history is very, very important, the people who kept these wish lists, how they were used in order to organize collaborative research in the early days of experiment was all very important. But even more so, it said something very fundamental to me about, again, essentially what the scientific attitude is. Very often we think today about empiricism. That's kind of the state of the art in history of science right now, that modern science is about studying reality and studying facts. But wish lists are not empirical tools. These things don't exist. You can't study them because they don't exist. They are a method for kind of expanding our imagination, for putting targets out there that you think might in fact be impossible. And a lot of these wish lists coexisted with lists of impossibilities, sometimes by the same author, who would take things that might be impossible and put them on their wish list. And they were saying, this is a tool for us to expand our realm of possibility, to think that, you know, this might not be possible, but it's so desirable for this reason, for that reason, because it serves the public interest, that I think it's worthwhile to put it out there as a marker for what we could aim for. And this is such a broad-based phenomenon, this genre. I think it really kind of changes the story of how people thought about possibility and reality in the early days of science.
Who are these people? Are they courtiers?
A lot of them are, because you don't get paid to be a scientist in the 17th century, so you have to be quite wealthy. So there are quite a few people like Robert Boyle, who's the son of an earl and is not making his money, never even took a degree, so is not making his money as a professor. But also academics would sometimes keep these lists. They're very anti-academic in their first century. Leibniz, in one of his very first publications, he's 21 years old, publishes a desiderata list, wish list for the reform of law, specifically as an attack upon the universities. Just been turned down for a law degree, and so he says, I will revise the whole study of law. Here's this wish list for how this should look. So now we think of these kind of epistemic wish lists like desiderata lists. It's a term of art we use in the academy. Oh, my research fulfills this desideratum. Think of it as this musty old jargon. But it was, in fact, a very radical tool to reform the whole shape of knowledge when it was first invented.
So how many of these things are there? Like 5,000 or 200? Or?
Well, their first century is mostly in manuscript, so Lord knows how many are out there. There are very few of them printed because going into print is a bold move, and to go into print and tell the whole world of learning this is what you should be studying, this is what you should be pursuing, it takes a lot of chutzpah to do that. So Francis Bacon did that, but not very many people went into print after that immediately. Leibniz is in fact one of the first. He's a very brash young man when he does this. Later, the genre proliferates to such an extent, 18th, 19th century, there's far more than 5,000 out there. It changes its meaning, of course, over time. They become simply collector's lists in the in the 19th century for books or manuscripts that you'd like to have, or specimens for botanists will publish their desiderato lists. So the genre has an interesting change, and there's a lot that we can say about the way we conceptualize scientific collaboration by tracking how these shared wish lists change over time.
So we've got about a minute and a half left, so this will probably be the last question. What plans do you have for the Oregon Rare Books Initiative during the coming academic year?
Well, one thing that we'd really like to do is stress how this collection could be used in the classroom. So we'd like to have a pedagogy workshop. We would like to beef up the use of the internet for classroom purposes, have student-curated sites on there where students who are working with materials can feature their work. We are having Todd Reeser from University of Pittsburgh will be our first speaker in the fall. I might give a talk myself. And we have a slate that we are currently developing for this coming year and we're pretty excited about.
Well, sorry. I want to thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us this afternoon. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you, likewise.
I've been speaking with Vera Keller, Assistant Professor of History at the University of Oregon's Robert D. Clark Honors College. She's a co-organizer of the Oregon Rare Books Initiative, a research interest group supported by the Oregon Humanities Center. Thanks so much for watching.